Welcome everyone to this webinar hosted by USABO and USABO alumni. We're so excited to have so many people tune into the event, and we hope you are looking forward to the great experience today just as much as we are. Today, we will be hearing advice from multiple USABO finalists. From this webinar, you will be able to learn how to prepare for the prestigious semifinal exam set to take place in late March. My name is Leanne Tai, and I will be hosting today's webinar. Before we start, I want to say congratulations to all of the 2022 semifinalists. Whether or not you are taking the semifinal exam this year, or you're planning to embark on this journey in the coming years, this webinar will be helpful to everyone, and we would like to welcome you to our event today. We are so honored to have Mrs. Kathy Frame, the advisor and consultant of USABO, to guide us today. We're also very happy to have our guest speakers. We have Catherine Wang, Judson Lam, and Albert Zhang, who are all USABO finalists. Very excited to share our knowledge and experiences, so let's get started. Just as a quick overview, today we will be starting off with reviewing what's new for this year's USABO competition and move into recommended studying strategies for the exam. The semifinal exam consists of 3 parts, where the panelists will be presenting their advice on how to study and how to practice for each part of the exam. And then we will end with a Q&A session. Feel free to send in questions throughout the webinar, and we will answer them according to the time available at the end. But please be sure to put the questions in the Q&A box and not the chat so that our panelists can reply to your question individually. So let's get started with an overview of the semifinal exam, which will be presented by Mrs. Kathy Frame. Mrs. Frame is a lifetime educator who has worked with the USABO when it was run by students at Harvard in the 90s. The Center for Excellence in Education started its sponsorship in 2002, and she continued to contribute to the program. From 2009 until 2018, she served as director and now serves as USABO consultant and advisor. Let's welcome Mrs. Frame as she explains the semifinal exam.
Thank you so much, Leanne. And again, congratulations to all the semifinalists for this year and those that are going to be here next year. Right. The exam itself has 3 parts. It has part A, B, and C. A is a multiple choice selection, 1 response, and each of those questions have a point value of 1. Part B is a little more complex, and they have a sequence of multiple choice questions, and in that section, more than 1 answer will be correct. So you have to put down all of the answers. When it's scored, all right, that particular section, you either get all of them correct or not. So for example, if the answer is A, B, C, and you have all 3, you get 2 full points. If you only get A and C, you get 0 points. So it's a lot of interpretation and calculation of graphs, and much more complex, a lot of thinking skills in that. Part C is a short answer essay and multiple true false choice questions, and the points on those vary, and we'll be talking about those later. Okay, you have different certificates. All right, everyone's always asking about that. For the open exam, we have the semifinalist, all right, and we have honorable mention, which is new, that'll be coming out, and merit, which is new, and then participant. Semifinalist certificates are emailed out, sent by post to your teachers so that they can use them in award ceremonies. Honorable mention will be new this year, and that will be coming out soon, as will the merit, and they'll be coming by email. Participant is online. Your teacher will download those and distribute them to you individually. For the USABO semifinal exam recognition certificates, of course, we have the national finalists, and then we have recognition of excellence, which is the top 50, and then honorable mention, which is new, and merit, which is also new, and participant. Participant has always been there, and that's one, again, that can be downloaded on the page itself. But those are all forthcoming, and it will take us time. That's a lot of certificates to get out. So we appreciate your patience with that part.
Thank you, Mrs. Frame. That was a great introduction to this webinar and to the exam. And at this time, I would like to welcome our speakers. We will first be hearing from Catherine Wang. Catherine is a first-year MD PhD student at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Originally from Massachusetts, she competed at the USABO National Finals in 2016 to 2017 and represented Team USA at the 2017 International Biology Olympiad, where she earned a gold medal. She then attended Stanford University for undergrad and continued studying biology with a minor in visual art. She will be going over Part A and also just general studying resources for the entire exam. Let's welcome Catherine.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thank you, Leanne, for running this webinar, and congratulations everyone for making semifinals. I'm supposed to be talking about Part A. I think if you are good at Part B, you will automatically be good at Part A. The questions for Part A are a little more straightforward, and they are more kind of memorization based. You just need to know the answer sometimes, as opposed to be able to do slightly more complicated critical thinking problems. But so the resources I'm about to talk about should be good for both Part A and B and C. Obviously, Campbell's biology is kind of the mainstay for the USABO content. If you have made semifinals, you're probably rather familiar with this book, so I won't belabor the point. But you do need to know everything in Campbell, and that includes like knowing the structures of like molecules that are presented in the book, and like knowing the diagrams, even if they don't seem that important, and any like protist or invertebrate or anything mentioned in Campbell is fair game. So you don't want to lose points on something that's in Campbell because this book is right there. There are going to be several topics that Campbell doesn't cover in sufficient depth, but the ones that are sufficient, at least in my opinion, are taxonomy, ecology, molecular biology and microbiology, with the exception of certain lab methods and data interpretation. Campbell does a great job with animal physiology, and that includes humans, except for some pathophysiology, which is the study of human diseases. And it covers, in theory, all you need to know for genetics and evolution. But because the problems in these topics tend to be a little more involved, sometimes just reading Campbell is not enough to build the intuition you need in order to solve the more challenging problems. But the information that you technically need to extrapolate from should be in Campbell. So going outside of Campbell now, we'll start with biochemistry. So the USABO operates at a level that's sort of similar to maybe a second year undergraduate biochemistry course, believe it or not, which is very advanced for high schoolers. And so I think that a good textbook to use is Principles of Biochemistry by Leninger. You don't need to read the whole book. I think that, well, at least when I was studying, I only used maybe chapters 1 through 10. Basically, like the Campbell biochemistry chapter is basically just one chapter that has separate sections on the different macromolecules. Leninger will have 1 or 2 chapters dedicated to each class of macromolecule. And so it goes into a lot more detail. It does go into a little too much detail, but hopefully if you're taking enough kind of practice exams and you're familiar enough with the competition, you will have a bit of an instinct for like what seems really out of scope versus what seems like it matches up with the questions that you've seen before. But you do have to use your own discretion a little bit. Other resources that I don't think are required, but I found sort of helpful for review are the BRS biochemistry series, which is a book that a lot of medical students use to brush up on biochemistry before their boards. It lists information in a very bullet point style, so I wouldn't recommend using it as a first pass, but as sort of like a last minute strategy to patch holes, it's pretty good. I am an advocate for biochemistry for dummies, not that anyone's a dummy, but I think it does a good job of explaining concepts in very plain terms with very clear molecular mechanisms. And the MCAT biochemistry review is actually also sort of at the same level as USABO, so that is helpful. Again, USABO is surprisingly advanced in biochemistry is what I found after going through college. There are certain topics that you shouldn't miss. And so if you don't have time to read any of these, I would recommend at least watching some YouTube videos that go over these things. So enzyme kinetics, amino acid biochemistry, including like isoelectric focusing and titrations, protein purification methods, and like the different types and why you would use one over the other, and like reading ligand binding curves, especially hemoglobin. Hemoglobin comes up a lot. So just very like high yield topics that you should look at. Moving on to molecular biology, I think Campbell does a pretty good job with molecular biology. Some people have read like all of this book, Molecular Biology of the Cell, which is sort of the industry standard for like a college level mobile textbook. I think this textbook is way overkill, to be honest. I never read the whole thing. A lot of people told me I should, and I tried and I didn't like it, so I stopped. But I do think that chapters specifically 7 and 8 are pretty good. 7 is on like molecular biology lab techniques, and 8 is on microscopy. And these are topics that Campbell does not do a very thorough job of covering. And I would sort of recommend, like, I know that one of the hardest topics to study for USABO is lab techniques, because many of us don't have experience reading papers or doing experiments, and it's hard to know like what type of technique is, you know, fair game and what isn't, because there isn't a textbook that says what it is. I would just say that if anytime a technique comes up in Campbell, or in like these 2 chapters of Albert's, or in a practice test that you've seen, I would go kind of follow up on that technique on Wikipedia or YouTube or something, and really understand what it's used for, like what the application is, the kind of general overview of what the steps are, and also what the data output looks like, so you can interpret the data that's generated by that technique. And so I've put together like a list of techniques that I'm not going to read out loud, just off the top of my head. I don't think this is complete, but you definitely should know what all of these are. And these are mentioned in Albert's and Campbell and in the semifinals. But you definitely have to kind of be resourceful and go online to kind of get some good schematics about these. For genetics and evolution, I think this is a really tricky topic to study for, because there just aren't that many, or like the best way to practice these sort of mathy problems is to do a lot of practice problems, but there aren't that many available, at least that are at the exact level that USABO has. And so I, in my senior year of high school, read Klug's Concepts of Genetics and Principles of Genetic Analysis. I thought they were pretty helpful. I don't really know which one's better. Like, I think they just kind of rounded out my perspective on genetics and kind of explicitly told me how to solve certain problems that until then had seemed kind of mysterious. But I don't know if this is the best use of your time. I will say that I made camp the year before without using these textbooks, so they're, you know, good to have, but not completely necessary. In terms of finding like practice problems and explanations, I think this is the highest yield thing you can do. MIT OpenCourseWare has some foundational genetics courses with problem sets and final exams that you can take. I think some of those problems are sort of more involved than the ones on USABO, but they go over the same concepts. And so you can kind of look into the problem solving and like probability strategies that you need to use. There is this guy, Nikolai, on YouTube that has a whole series on genetics lessons where he like puts up a problem and then walks you through how to solve it. And so if you go on his channel, you can kind of parse through those and see which ones seem relevant to USABO, or, you know, questions that you tend to have trouble with, and then literally see this guy walk you through how exactly to do it. There are a good number of lecture notes and problem sets that are just published by universities. And these are sometimes like taken down over time. So the ones that I used in high school might not still be up, but anyway, you can usually find those. And also past IBO exams are a good kind of trove of questions here, I think. Like, you don't have to do every single 6-hour practice exam. You can just go and do all the genetics problems if you wanted to. And that can be a good way to just like get a lot of exposure in. I think what you'll notice over time is that there are only so many types of problems that can come up in genetics and evolution. And so it won't be too long before you've like just seen most of them already. Certain topics that you don't want to miss, in addition to just the basics, are in addition to normal Hardy-Weinberg, you want to think about non-classical Hardy-Weinberg, like when you have multiple alleles or an X-linked trait. Hamilton's rule is really important. Gene mapping, polygenic inheritance, where you have like a normal distribution of like alleles. Epigenetics in dihybrid crosses. So when you might get like a 9:3:1 versus a 12:3:1 ratio in the offspring. And another thing that tends to come up a lot that's kind of random is the coefficient of relatedness in honeybees, which are like they have that haplodiploid system of sex determination. So anyway, all these things that are, some of them aren't really mentioned in Campbell, you want to be thinking about for semifinals. For human physiology, I think that Campbell's is honestly almost like maybe 95% sufficient for human physiology. But if you did want to read another book, I would recommend Vander's Human Physiology. I think it's really well written, and there are certain kind of systems that you might want to prioritize more than others because they tend to be tested often, like neuro, immune, cardiac, endocrine, and excretory, as opposed to like development, for example. Please don't hate me, by the way, if there ends up being like 20 developmental biology questions on the semifinal. This is just from past experience. But in terms of like outside of Campbell things to think about in human physiology, I would think about like the clinical tests for each system. You can get questions sometimes that are like, patient comes in with so-and-so symptoms, or so-and-so lab results, and you want to know how to interpret them. And so for like, you could have electrical recordings of the heart and brain, like a muscle force length relationship to test like the strength of a muscle, immune activation assays and blood tests and urine tests. This doesn't mean go online and memorize like every single lab value. This means like know what, you know, a high white blood cell count might mean, or know what like, you know, protein in your urine might mean. And yeah, I don't think you need to memorize the names of specific diseases, but you do need to know basic pathophysiology. If you really understand physiology, you should sort of be able to extrapolate pathophysiology, like what would happen if you had too much versus too little thyroid hormone. But sometimes just having like read exactly what the symptoms of hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism are, and then reflecting on how that relates to the physiology is also a good training exercise and makes your reaction time a bit faster on the exam. Lastly, something that comes up sometimes is histology, which is the study of these like microscopic slides, are like these little slices of tissue that are stained, and you can see the subcellular structures and also these kind of tissue level structures, and you need to identify what tissue you're looking at. I think most of the histology questions, if they do come up on semifinals, are written with the intent that like, if you know the physiology, you should be able to sort of figure out what this is just by looking at it. But sometimes I think that's still a bit of a tall ask. And so my strategy for studying histology is to think of like every single organ system or like tissue that might be important that you've heard of in Campbell that could come up, and just going on Google and looking at like pictures of it. For example, you could think about the digestive tract and be like esophagus histology, and then like stomach histology, small intestine histology, large intestine histology. And then you will be able to kind of get a sense for what the different parts of the digestive tract look like. And you can make yourself a notes document or something like that. Histology doesn't come up too often. I think it's a bit like, it would be considered a hard question. But sometimes, you know, they'll show you a picture of a lung section or something, and you should be able to tell that there are alveoli there and things like that. And so it helps to have seen the picture before. For plants, this is something that Campbell for sure does not cover in enough depth. And so I would recommend reading like the last 10-ish chapters of Raven's Biology of Plants. I think the chapter numbering varies a little bit between editions, but it's like the ones on gymnosperms and angiosperms, it's like 18 to 29 or something in my copy. So you should basically know everything that's in these chapters. The things that you don't need to know that sometimes people talk about as if you do need to know are the like specific characteristics of all the plant families and floral formulas, like the fruit and leaf morphologies, or like very specific tiny little details about the non-vascular plant life cycles or structures. I think it's like sometimes this comes up like every couple of years, but for the most part, that is like very low yield stuff that I wouldn't spend like weeks memorizing. But things that you don't want to miss that a lot of people do are like the symptoms of different nutrient deficiencies, the nitrogen cycle, like what the cross sections of a lot of plant tissues look like, different classes of secondary metabolites, the molecular mechanisms behind like photoperiodism and all the tropisms, like the hormones, the derived traits of different clades throughout evolution. And so you should be very familiar with words like tracheophyte, chlorophyte, like magnoliophyta, or angiosperms like eudicots, monocots, things like that. And lastly, something that comes up pretty frequently nowadays is statistics. I think the sort of amount of statistics that you need to know is like, it's a subsection of like AP statistics. And thankfully, there's a lot of online resources for statistics on YouTube, even that like kind of operate at this level. Any kind of introductory biostatistics course will have all this information as like the first couple lectures. But basically, you should be able to interpret alpha as a threshold for statistical significance, understand what statistical significance means. You should know these words and kind of, you don't need to memorize the formulas necessary or derive them, but know how to interpret the values. So like understand what a normal distribution means, variance, standard deviation, z-score, percentiles, p-value, identifying a null versus alternative hypothesis, and what does reject versus fail to reject mean, mean, median, range, like a skewed distribution, and also sensitivity versus specificity for certain like tests. In terms of significance testing, the two that are important here are chi-square test and the student's t-test, and you should know the difference between a one-tailed test and a two-tailed test. I think you should memorize the chi-squared formula. You definitely don't need to memorize the t-test formula, but you should know how to implement it. Like if it was given to you, you should know what to plug in. You should interpret the test statistic that's generated by each of these formulas against like these value tables. And you should also know when to use one versus the other. And again, you will see these tests come up sometimes in practice problems. So really think about like, what are the types of problems that could come up that use these types of tests? And there really aren't that many. Like for chi-square tests, I've like really only seen them for like testing like genetic crosses and like population genetics to see whether it was or was not under Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So yeah. And lastly, these are just some general study strategies for like semifinals in particular. I'm sure if you've made it this far, you like know how to take notes and like memorize things and stuff like that. I think it's important to really chase after practice problems that you got wrong and really understand why you got them wrong, and understand that if you got a question wrong, it's because not only did you not know the answer to that, you probably didn't know a lot of the information just like in that realm of biology. So you should go and study like everything around that. Again, utilize past IBO exams to go over specific topics. So if you're struggling with plants, go do every single plant question. You can, like the internet is full of explanations if you just ask it for an explanation. And also lastly, I know I mentioned a lot of textbooks and they are expensive if you buy them new, but if you buy an old edition used on Amazon or download a PDF, I mean, if you download a PDF, it's free, but if you buy an old edition used, it's usually like less than $20. So it can be quite affordable. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That's very, very helpful information. And I'm sure we all learned a lot from it. If you have any questions for Catherine, feel free to enter them in the Q&A box, and be sure to check the answered questions to see if a question you want to ask has already been answered. So now we will be moving into part B. We will get the chance to hear great advice from Judson and Albert. Judson Lamb is a freshman at MIT majoring in bioengineering. In high school, he attended the virtual USABO finals in 2020 and 2021 and qualified for the international team and earned gold medals in both years. Albert grew up in Los Angeles and is now a freshman at Stanford University. He was not only a winner as a USABO finalist in 2019, 2020, and 2021, he was also a virtual IBO gold medalist. So let's welcome our speakers.
All right, cool. So Albert and I are just going to kind of give some more advice in addition to Catherine's about how maybe you could approach the Part B section of the semi, which proves to be a little bit more challenging. So I think one of the biggest questions that I get is how to approach the more like application or like lab-based questions that come up. So stuff that's not just direct like memory recall, it's like a little bit more involved. Sometimes there's like a huge wall of text that they somehow magically think you need to parse. And I guess like my number one piece of advice for these questions is to not panic. So I mean, it may seem intimidating on how much like different stuff is going on, how much unfamiliar things there are. But these problems are like solvable, right? They're definitely doable. So make sure you kind of go through with a clear head, focus on the things you understand, the things that seem important, maybe even underline them if possible. And there's usually a lot of fluff in the text that's kind of just there, but not really important to the question they're asking. So try to focus on the parts that are important and the stuff that you do know. And try to like not get like distracted by the more confusing parts or the less important parts or the parts that don't seem that important to the question. So the text is there to try to like explain what's going on. Again, the reason the text is there is because we maybe do not expect you to know some information related to the question. So we want to give you that information so you can like have enough like background or have enough stuff there with your background knowledge that you can solve the question. So just remember the text is there to kind of help you and not really kind of confuse you or mess you up completely. So another thing to keep in mind though is like these questions are usually more than just memory recall. As I said, you'll have to do a little bit of logic, have to think a little bit more about these questions instead of kind of just being like, oh, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So try to keep an eye on like the big high level question, high level thinking, like what's going on here, like maybe in like non-biology terms, like what's moving around, like how does this work? So just kind of think about the big picture a little bit more. And I know some people like to actually read like the question at the very end before they read the whole text. And if that helps you, that is a good strategy to kind of focus on like what the important parts are. And then lastly, again, these are hard questions. So it's completely okay if you come out of it like, I have no idea, guess, or you can eliminate a few answers and then guess as well. That's completely fine. Just these questions are hard. So be fine with like having like a educated guess. So that's all good.
Yep. So here we just have an example problem from a previous semifinal exam to kind of illustrate the points that Judson was talking about. So I guess so here you kind of like have a small wall of text and then you have a big picture and like, what do I do? Then so you can just try to, just like, I can do this. So you start reading it. So AKI10 is a gene of unknown function. So the name of this gene is probably not important, right? So you can just like skip with acute kidney injury. That's probably important. So you can highlight kidney or something like that. And then so you generate these knockout mice, meaning they don't have this gene, okay? And you collect the urine. So urine is an important word. So you highlight urine. So you have kidney and urine, right? And then you run on an STS page gel followed by staining. So if you know what an STS page gel and Kumamasi staining are, that's obviously good. But if you don't get scared by these words because it tells you that it's two visualized proteins, right? So you can just skip gel, skip staining, you just say visualized proteins, so you underline that. So now you have urine samples and you're visualizing their proteins. And then so you can look at the picture, you see on the left there's the wild type and there are no proteins, or there's nothing there, right? So you can probably infer there are no proteins. And then on the right, there is the mutant mice and they have a lot of proteins there. So after reading this, you should just get your keywords are protein and urine, and like acute kidney injury. So then it's like what could have happened in this right side that caused the protein to go into the urine? Because normally there isn't protein in urine, right? So then this will be the point when you'll have to use your background knowledge that in the kidney there's kind of like the plasma membrane kind of like filters out. There are various filters for the proteins that prevent the proteins from going into the urine. So then something that would cause the protein to go into the urine would probably be located on the plasma membrane, right? So then you can look at the answer choices and you see that B is plasma membrane, so you can choose B. So yeah, so the entire process is basically trying to reduce this wall of text and the picture to just like a simple thing of like what are the keywords and what is the key difference between the two parts of this picture.
All right, yep. And then I guess the next set of questions that I get asked about a lot is like the more math questions. So usually these are like more genetics related. And I think a lot of people get tripped up here is when they kind of start studying for these. And then I think somehow there's a tricky question on that comes up on the test that kind of tweaks the question a little bit so that you can't kind of use the same strategy you're always using to solve like these problems the same way. So I think the most important part when it comes to studying and trying to answering these questions is being able to like kind of think about what's happening mathematically a little bit more like flexibly and understanding like what each part of the math is doing, like what each number represents, how the things come together to kind of explain what is going on in our system here. So try not to treat like the solution as just, oh, these are the set of steps I have to go through to get the answer. This is more of like, okay, this is a way I can kind of use this information to get this piece of knowledge. And this is maybe not be the only way to do it. And I understand what each part of this is saying. So maybe if they change the problem slightly, I can also understand how to change my solution slightly to get the answer they're going for. So make sure you know what's going on in each step. Maybe when you're practicing, try to like vary it up. For example, maybe instead of like, maybe 2 alleles for Hardy-Weinberg, what happens if there are 3 alleles? I mean, that's a pretty big jump, but kind of thinking through what each thing means and how the solution would change if that happened. And then more concretely, I think the main math topics needed for USABO in the semis are the following here. So algebra and logarithms are pretty important. Those are mostly taught in school though. So those are usually fine. And then probability and then statistics are the more less commonly taught like in normal school. So usually I recommend people to do the most studying in there. So some topics include like counting, Bayes' theorem. I think Campbell's also talks briefly about some basic probability stuff. So definitely try to study those if you don't feel too strong with that.
Yeah, so next are some studying strategies to when you're trying to read the textbooks and then know the information. One thing in general I would say is that unlike in like for example in math or like physics Olympiads and stuff like that, where kind of doing the practice question is a huge part of like besides reading books and things like that to try to know how to do the test. In biology, the main part is still just like knowing things from the books. You can do some practice questions to help with like part B stuff, but the main thing is still like knowing pieces of information and having like a coherent sense of the systems and things like that. So yeah, so in terms of, because there's a lot of details in biology, and surprising as it may seem, I found that there are often underlying patterns or like logic can be something that can be pretty helpful instead of just straight rote memorization in trying to make sense of a lot of these details, especially in areas like human physiology, animal physiology, or cellular or molecular biology, for example. And we just have 2 examples here of how you could try to use logic. One would be, if, for example, if you're thinking about DNA replication, there are a lot of enzymes that are involved. There's helicase, topoisomerase, DNA polymerase, etc. So if you're just straight trying to memorize all of these, that might be difficult. But then if you just try to do a little like shift in your frame of reference and you think instead, like if I were the cell and I needed to replicate a piece of DNA, then what would I have to do? So then you think, okay, DNA is wound up as a double helix, so you'll need something to unwind it so that you can like get to the nucleotides and actually replicate them, right? So I need an unwinder. Oh, it's a helicase. And then, when you unwind it, there might come some like stress comes up when you try to unwind it. and then so you need to provide summaries, and then you need something to like actually replicate it, right? So then that can be DNA polymerase. So this is kind of like a simple example, but this kind of, you can kind of apply this way of thinking of like, if I were the cell, what would I need to do this function? And then try to kind of like derive your way through, or like just make more sense of the many different things that are happening in various like biological systems. And then another example would be this picture up here, which is the stomach wall lining. So if you look at the names, you have the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and then you have the surface epithelium lining of propria and the muscularis mucosae. There are a lot of words here, and it might be pretty hard to like try to memorize all the order and all the words and things like that, right? So then maybe if you, so you can try to find some patterns, for example. So one pattern that you can find is there is the muscularis externa, that's a muscle layer. Then you have the submucosa, which is like a blood and nerve layer. And then you have the mucosa, which is like a surface layer. So then you have the structure, it's muscle, nerves, and like surface, right? And then if you look at the mucosa, the structure there is also at the bottom, you have the muscle layer. And then in the middle, you have the lamina propria, which contains like blood vessels and neurons and stuff like that. And then you have the and then you have the surface layer as well. So you can see there's kind of like a pattern, or like some kind of fractal like pattern here in that it's like muscle, nerve, and then surface, and then it's and then in the mucosa again it's the same thing. So like, yeah, so after I realized this, and made this diagram a lot easier to memorize, right? Because you kind of have like a structure in mind that you can think about. So this is sort of two examples of like the logic that you can try to use when studying biology. Yeah, and then as for different studying strategies, there are many different studying strategies, and nobody really studies the same way. So you'll basically have to try different ways out and see what works best for you. So these strategies may include taking notes. Taking notes. You can review your notes. You can reread the book, reread the chapters. You can annotate the chapters in the book. You can annotate your notes, which I did a lot. You can watch videos online. So yeah, you'll really have to see what works best for you. Like just one example for me is I used to take paper notes because I heard that writing on paper was better than like typing, like it made you memorize more. But then I realized that what really helped me was reviewing my notes, and not actually like reviewing my notes helped me more than just like taking them. But I couldn't really review my paper notes because I would have trouble reading my handwriting. So then I switched to taking typed notes so that I could like print them out and review them that way. And then eventually I settled into a routine where you like read a chapter, you take notes, you print them out, you annotate them, you read the notes and things like that. So these are kind of routines that you'll have to figure out for yourself as you study, and it's different for every person. But one thing that is generally pretty important is setting ambitious goals for your studying, scheduling out your studying. So you have like by X day or X week, I will have read X number of chapters from this book or something like that. Right. So setting ambitious goals and like trying to keep up with them, though it may be hard to keep up with them, but like trying your best to keep up with them is generally something that is pretty important for however you study.
All right, cool. And then the last thing is in the test, here's some quick strategies to help you out. So the number one kind of strategy I use is process of elimination. So again, USABO, for the most part, is a multiple choice test. So if you can eliminate like one or two answers, that's just going to help you a lot, especially if you're trying to guessing. As you know, a 1 in 2 guess and a 1 in 3 guess is much better than a 1 in 5 guess. So any little bit definitely helps. And then also, again, the semi is a very long exam. I don't think you're expected to like finish it in the period of time you're given. I know I always had trouble finishing it on time. I'd have to like rush through the last like 10, 15 questions. And I think I would still be considered like a faster one compared to my peers. So I think it's definitely a very long test. So you're not expected to finish. So that being said, if you, again, run into one of those big walls of text and you have no idea what's going on, it's not worth it to try to take the extra like 10, 15 minutes to try to figure out what's going on. Maybe just like put down a quick guess and then keep going. Again, no one really finishes and just kind of know that. So you don't feel too worried about skipping. But I would still put down a guess and maybe start in case you magically have time at the end. But again, don't expect to be able to do every question or give every question like enough time. And then also, again, as I said, there's a big time crunch. So I try to go in with like a game plan. So I know some people I talked to like to do like the part C first, like the writing portion first. Whereas I had a friend who always told me to do part B ecology first because that was the most reliably like easy section to warm up on or something. But I personally just kind of went front to back. Again, if you're jumping around the test, I would just be careful because oftentimes you can miss bubble or kind of accidentally skip questions that you didn't mean to. So if you're going to choose one of those other strategies, it's good to like trying to practice ahead of time so you kind of know what to expect and kind of get some experience with that. And then lastly, it is a long test. It is all about endurance. So don't be too discouraged if you run to like 2, 3, 4 questions. You don't really know what's going on. You don't really understand. You had to guess. Just keep soldiering forward. Again, the test is very difficult, even for all of us who ended up being finalists. So just keep going through, and you got this. And keep trying your best, and you'll do great. So yeah, I think that's all the things that we had for you about part B.
Thank you so much, Judson and Albert. It's not every day we get to hear such helpful advice. So again, if you have any questions regarding that, you can check the questions that have been answered or put in new questions in the Q&A box. So now we'll be moving on to part C, which will be presented by Mrs. Kathy Frame. And she will be debriefing the overall structure and what the scores are looking for the FRQ section. Let's welcome Mrs. Frame again.
So this is part C, and this is the one that Judson said, you know, some people start in the beginning with it. Some people leave it to the end. You just have to decide yourself. So this is some of the ideas with it. These are actually finalists out at Purdue taking the theory exam back in 2016. Right. Best thing you can do is to be prepared. All right. Remember, you've got to register again with AOPS. Right. So I'm going to give you some of the details. You'll take the number that you had, your ID number with AOPS, and make sure that you register with them. If your number, they will have your copy of your number, and you'll be able to, those are the only students that will be able to take the exam itself. The next thing is there's a practice exam. And the practice exam this year will be March 24th. That practice exam is like the practice exam that was used for the Open. Shows you how to log in, fill out all of the forms, actually practice taking some of the tests. And the most important part is uploading part C. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Tips for that big file at the end. A lot of people had issues last year. Everything has to go in a PDF, and you'll have 30 minutes at the conclusion of the exam to upload that part C. All right. So if the file is too big, and that was a case last year, resize it. Right. And you can do it in a couple of ways. You can use Acrobat, where you can go over and down in the drop-down menu, select reduce size of PDF. And it should reduce the size for you, and you should be able to send it. Right. Another thing you can do, there's a program called, I think it's called PDF, excuse me, small PDF. And look at that now, all right? This website will be available, all right? And see what you could have to do for that. Other option is to take a picture with your phone, okay? A physical copy of it. All right, or if you have a scanner, do it with that. 300 DPI will be just fine. Right? These are the copies that the scoring panel are going to be taking a look at. So make sure that you get those. If you're using a phone, you should be able just to adjust the settings on your phone while you're, after you've got the picture itself, and then send it and submit it. Remember, it says reduce the size of this file, and then you can send it. So those are the issues with that. This, I can't emphasize, practice, practice, practice this section so you don't get concerned about not being able to upload, all right, this particular portion. You can start doing that now. And when you do the practice exam, you'll have the opportunity to do that. So I stress, please take that practice exam that'll be available this year, 2022, on March 24th. Example, the skills that are going to be tested, data interpretation for certain, all right? you may be given a set of data, you may have to construct that data, you may have to do graph analysis of it, a written description of it. All those things might be involved in it. Graphs, make sure you understand axes and different kinds, logarithmic graphs as well, all right, and values. Formula applications. Catherine was talking about some of the ones in genetics that, that you maybe want to put under your belt, and also in statistics. If there are difficult formulas, they'll be within the problem itself. So you don't have to worry about knowing that. Just know how to use the formula and plug in the information you have to get your answers. So practice, practice, practice. Communication skills, be able to write. Make sure you make, I suggest, an outline of what you want to say in your response to the question itself. Make sure it has all the parts, and then clear, concise English. Don't put a lot of flowery language. Flowery language just distracts people. Get to the essence of what you want to report back about the answer to that question. Last one is very important, concept analysis and comparison. And I would say that the whole portion of that exam is about that. All the concepts that you've been looking at in Campbell's and Leninger's and Albert's, all of those are in there, and they're going to ask you to compare those particular pieces of information along that. So be able to do that particular kind of analysis and verbally, write it in clear, concise English. Get in a little trouble. All right. So question types. There are 2 question types in the part C. There's multiple true false, and the next one is the short answer. Multiple true false, all right, look like a multiple choice question, but unlike Judson said, you can reason out 1, 2, or 3 and get a response. With these, you have to respond to every single one of them, all right? And that actually allows us to see what your ability is in order to use logic and reasoning to answer each one of those. So they're very carefully crafted to do that. And so you'll know the concept, or you won't know the concept, all right, as you go through it. And actually going through that will help you with it too, sometimes with the concept. The short answer can be data analysis, interpretation. They could have charts for you to analyze, and then to actually do some written explanation of those charts as well. Definition and explanation. You might have a research paper that's placed there, and you're asked to do the analysis of it. All right, you're given the key components of it, 2 graphs and such. And then relationships between the data, between if it's organisms and their structures, just as Albert was speaking to with his question. Those are the types of things that you'll see as far as questions. They're certainly not listed to this particular type. So some tips prior to the semifinal exam and during the semifinal exam. Prior to the exam, study for understanding. Don't memorize everything. Make sure you've been reading this and reading this. Make sure you start to put all of that knowledge together. Like, focus on topics and concepts. Self-test yourself. Write a good question yourself and then test yourself on it. See if you can answer it. Work with a partner to do it. It's one of the best ways, all right, to learn how to answer these types of questions. It's practice with somebody else, a buddy. And then I always suggest you read all the questions first, just so you have a concept. And like Judson was saying, if it's something you have no clue about, don't waste your time on it, all right? There's plenty of questions there for you to answer, all right? Make sure you read the instructions. Very, very important. Each question will have a point value attached to it. If it has like a 0.5 and another question has 8 points on it, you do the math, okay? You'd rather work for the 8 points than the 0.5, right? So take a look at all of that. Budget your time. Take a look. You'll have a timer in the upper right-hand corner, all right, as you're doing the exam itself. Say to yourself, okay, so I spent X amount of time on A, B, and C. You might even want to gauge that before you go in. And then you can keep track of that Part C time as you go through and how much time you're using on a particular question. Reread each question. You'll lose things, you'll read it quickly, and there'll be things that you will miss, all right? We try not to put too much fluff in these. There is a lot of fluff in the multiple choice, but in these, everything should have an important meaning for you. And then with your responses, be very thorough, but very concise. Remember, people are going to be reading 500 of these, okay? So we'll talk about that here. So the multiple true false, the scoring, you should be aware of it. It's scored by AOPS. It's not scored by hand. There's an algorithm that they use in order to give you your value of the questions. So number of multiple true false, vary each year. So some years we may only have 10, some years we may have 15 or 20, or maybe only 5. It just varies. So here's a sample question. It says cellular metabolism is bidirectional and complex. Indicate whether the following statements concerning the metabolic capabilities of an nucleated human cell are true or false. So each one of these, all right, is going to count for a value for 1 point. So just take a couple of minutes to go down through those and put down what you think those answers might be. And I'll give you 1 minute to do it, and then we'll go on. And this is a rather simple one. Okay, so here's the key. Take a look at what you had as your response. The first one was true. Next one was false. 3 was A, and 4 was A. Right. When I was in grad school, I had a professor that always made us give an explanation for every response that we had in a multiple choice question. He was sort of like a precursor to the multiple true false. I learned so much by being able to do that. And when you study questions, that's another good study technique that you can have. As far as scoring, if you get all 4 of these correct, and say this is question 121, you get 1 point. If you get 3 of the responses correct, it's 0.6 points. If you get 0.6 of a point, and if you get 2, it's 0.2 of a point. And then if you get 1 or nothing, it's 0 value, all right? The grading of it, sorry, we're shooting on here. AOPS online scoring process, the score, just like you, when you're, you have to sign an honor code, they have to sign an honor code too, a confidentiality that they're not going to share what your responses are. They don't know who you are. Every one of you are a number to them. And if they have any spark of knowing who that person is, sometimes people will recognize writing. They have to disqualify themselves, then we get someone else to do the scoring. All right. So try to keep it on the up and up. Make sure that we have the honor code with those people that are working on it as well. Each question is assigned to a team of a minimum of 2 members. So that means if we have 425 tests, we have 8 questions that are in that short answer part. We have to have 8 sets of reviewers, all right, to take a look at that, because each one of them have to go over 400 questions, all right, one particular question. So what they do is they work from a rubric. The rubric's already been established, and they agree on that, but they also take a test run through about 50 or 100 of the papers that have been submitted and see if the rubric matches what the responses they're getting from the students. A lot of times when you are scoring essay questions and short answer, you realize there's more than one way to look at this particular problem, all right, or to answer it. So in all fairness, they make sure that that rubric includes those variations. And then they finalize and come to a consensus regarding where they'll start and complete that scoring itself and a scheme for it. And each team comes to a consensus, and those questions are submitted. It's all online to AOPS. And then once all of teams have scored all the questions, those results are submitted to AOPS. and they're included in the final score of the exam. Note, there's only one score for the exam. So we have those 3 parts, but all 3 of them give you 1 score for that exam. And I wish you good luck.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Frame, and thank you to all the speakers. So at this time, looking at the time, we may only be able to answer a few questions live. Please check the answer section in the Q&A box. There are a lot of questions that have been answered there already. And I think a lot of people have been wondering how much they should write for the Part C section in terms of quantity.
Don't worry about quantity, it's quality, concise. Put your ideas down in a very succinct manner.
And another question regarding research papers that was mentioned, someone asked, is there a category of research paper that, or how should they look for research papers to study?
I think anybody here can answer that. Where do you go, Judson, when you look at, or Albert?
Okay, so I guess like when I was studying, I didn't really do too much looking into research papers, but the definitely one category research papers will come up with is cell biology or biochemistry. So if you want to practice kind of reading that kind of text, I would definitely recommend cell biology or biochemistry. And it doesn't really come up, I would say, in any other category. So I mean, if anyone else has anything
and I would say especially things like trying to read the figures and understand what's going on in the figures, like the various lab techniques that are used, or like what this graph means, for example, or then just like the overall picture of the entire paper. These things would be important.
And I'm going to make a suggestion. Go to Science, AAAS has it. In the beginning of they publish it each week. They give like a layman's version of the research that's in the back, right, with all the graphs and charts, etc. So that gives you an understanding of what that particular researcher is going to do. And then you could go read that particular paper, and it gives you a better concept of what they're approaching and what those graphs and such mean. So that's another idea.
Okay, and just maybe 2 more questions. One, some people were wondering, now that there's only 1 month left until the semifinals, or less than 1 month, then how would you suggest to study or review during this time?
Yeah, I can try to take this one. I think it just depends on what you've already done. If you haven't read Raven's Biology of Plants, I would say maybe read Raven's Biology of Plants, or like an equivalent biology or plant biology textbook. I've been seeing questions being like, is this textbook better or is this textbook better? I think as long as they are a college level like book on the same topic, they will be comparable. I can only speak to the ones that I personally used. I think with like this being this close to the exam though, you do need to prioritize. Like if you feel more confident about certain topics than others, then you should focus on the ones that you don't feel as confident about. Definitely don't skip out on taking the practice exams though. I think like only a certain like number of topics are really available to be tested, and they come up again and again. And so just by taking semifinal exams and then getting questions wrong and then understanding why, and then like reading up on the stuff around the questions that you got wrong, you should be able to plug a lot of holes just by doing that. Yeah, but like I think like in biochem and mobile, all those like techniques and data interpretation, like those take a little bit of while to build up like just knowledge around, and so you might also want to like spend some time there. I wouldn't necessarily recommend like reading an entire textbook now. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think you need to, like when I was talking about my resources, I don't think you should read like Vander's or the genetics textbooks that I talked about. But I think like plants and biochem and like techniques are what you should focus on if you are going to read.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I think this will be the last question that we can go over live in this webinar. And just to end this off, thank you so much to all of our speakers, Catherine, Judson, Albert, and thank you, Mrs. Frame, for making this all possible today. if you have any further questions or any questions that we did not go over, you are welcome to look at any of the, you are welcome to contact the emails listed here. The recording for this webinar will be posted on the CE channel and emailed out to all registrants. So that is the end of this webinar, and I hope everyone learned a lot today. Thank you again for coming, and have a great day.
Thank you, Leanne.